In the twilight of the British Empire, amidst the hush of drawing rooms and the flicker of chandeliers, one casual introduction altered the course of a kingdom. It was the 1930s, an age trembling between old certainties and new freedoms, when Lady Thelma Furness, an American socialite of grace and wit, brought her dear friend Wallis Simpson into the company of the Prince of Wales. From that moment, a royal destiny unraveled into scandal, abdication, and exile. But tonight we ask, what if that moment had never happened? What if Thelma, on that idle February afternoon, had simply decided against arranging tea? My friends, wherever and whenever you are listening, tell me, where are you joining us from? A quiet evening at home? A morning walk beneath autumn leaves? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy these quiet journeys through the what-ifs of history, subscribe and stay with us. Together, we will step through the narrow doorway where fate once paused, and imagine the world beyond, London, 1929. The city is alive with a deceptive calm. Motor cars hum along Pall Mall, jazz drifts from Mayfair windows, and the air smells faintly of coal smoke and champagne. Britain, still the proud heart of a vast empire, hides its fatigue behind manners and melody. The Great War had ended a decade before, but its shadow still brushed the edges of every smile. The young and privileged danced through the uncertainty, determined to feel alive before the next tide of change arrived. At the center of this glittering orbit moved two figures destined, in another reality, to collide. The first was Edward, Prince of Wales, a man adored and misunderstood in equal measure. Handsome, restless, and impatient with the rituals of kingship, he embodied modern charm. Crowds followed him with adoration, sensing in him a kind of vulnerability their monarchs had never shown before. Yet behind his magnetic smile, Edward carried the loneliness of one who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. The other was Thelma Furness, vivacious, sharp, and beautiful in the effortless way that drew admiration without envy. Born Thelma Morgan in New York, she had married Viscount Furness, heir to a shipping fortune, and thus crossed from the New World into the Old. She was American enough to be daring, British enough to be accepted. She knew how to laugh at the right moments, to flatter with subtlety, and to soften the edges of aristocratic formality. To Edward, she was refreshingly human. Their friendship began as many did in that dazzling age, with laughter, fast cars, and whispered confidences in dimly lit rooms. Edward admired her independence, her refusal to bend entirely to the etiquette that suffocated him. Thelma, in turn, was touched by the melancholy behind his charm. He was a prince, yes, but one who longed to be an ordinary man. She saw it in the way he gazed out of palace windows, as though the world beyond were a lost paradise he would never reach. In the world we know, Thelma's role was that of a bridge, a link between the prince and another American, Wallis Simpson. But tonight, let us imagine the thread cut before it could not. Thelma never invites Wallis to tea. Perhaps she is tired that day. Perhaps the invitation slips her mind, or she deems it unimportant. The air stirs differently, the clock chimes unnoticed, and history, patient and watchful, takes a different path. In this alternate world, the prince's heart remains entangled with Thelma, though she is a woman of delicate balance, married, discreet, and aware of her limits. Their affection deepens but never crosses into the dangerous territories of scandal. Edward continues to seek warmth, yet he finds it only in fragments. A conversation, a shared glance, the brief comfort of someone who understands the hollowness of privilege. Thelma, aware of his vulnerability, becomes both confidant and guardian. London society whispers, as it always does. But without the fiery presence of Wallis Simpson, the whispers remain harmless, just another melody in the endless symphony of aristocratic gossip. There is no Wallis to challenge his sense of duty, no mirror reflecting back his rebellion, no force bold enough to test the limits of monarchy itself. The court breathes easily, the advisors smile, and the machinery of empire grinds on, unaware that it has just been spared a fracture that might have split its heart. Still, Edward feels it, that ache of something missing. Without Wallis's provocative strength, without her audacious charm, the prince drifts between duty and desire like a ship in fog. Thelma's affection soothes but does not anchor him. She cannot give him what he truly seeks, a purpose beyond the gilded cage. She remains, as she always was, a woman of grace and boundaries. And so the prince's restlessness deepens, becoming not defiance, but quiet despair. Beyond London's elegance, the world trembles toward change. In Berlin, a man named Hitler rises on promises of renewal. In America, the Great Depression gnaws at the spirit of prosperity. In the colonies, whispers of independence stir. Yet in Britain, the monarchy stands untouched, its most fragile heart still hidden behind polite laughter and pearls. The narrator's voice softens. Sometimes history is not moved by grand speeches or battles, but by simple introductions, or their absence. One friend not introduced, one invitation left unwritten, and the great river of destiny flows another way. Thelma, unaware of the weight her inaction carries, continues to host dinners, attend races, and smile for photographs. To her, it is just another season in London. To history, it is the beginning of a quiet miracle. A monarchy preserved, but a legend unborn. As autumn settles over England, the prince writes in his diary, words that in this reality no one will ever read aloud. I feel surrounded by walls of glass. They let in the light, but they keep me from touching the world. In those lines lies the first tremor of a story that will never erupt into scandal, but will instead fade into melancholy duty. The camera of time lingers upon Thelma, seated in her drawing room, unaware that the gentle scratch of her pen or the turning of a teacup has changed everything. Outside, London lights shimmer on wet cobblestones. The narrator breathes, allowing the moment to stretch like memory itself. What if, the voice asks quietly, the course of love had paused that day and in doing so saved a crown? Would we have lost something greater? The myth of love's defiance. The sound of a clock strikes softly, a door closes, and the story moves forward into the quiet years that follow, where affection endures, but passion sleeps, and the fate of nations begins to shift beneath calm surfaces. Winter settles upon London with a hush that seems almost ceremonial. The year is 1931, and within the damp fog that rolls across the Thames, the Prince of Wales walks alone through the palace gardens, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed beneath the weight of invisible chains. He is not yet a king, but already he feels the burden of inheritance pressing upon his heart. Without Wallis Simpson to ignite rebellion within him, his discontent becomes quieter, deeper, a tide that erodes the foundations of his will rather than crashing against them. Thelma remains by his side in friendship, her laughter still warm, her presence still kind, yet even she cannot rouse him from the growing stillness that gathers around his spirit. At official functions, Edward performs his duties with outward grace. He shakes hands with miners and veterans, visits hospitals and factories, and smiles for cameras that adore his modern ease. But behind every photograph lies the same weariness. A prince trying to belong to an empire whose language of duty feels foreign to his restless soul. In another life, he would have found in Wallis the mirror of his defiance, a woman unafraid to challenge his royal isolation. But now, without that spark, he drifts through engagements and ceremonies like an actor reciting a script written long before his birth. The courtiers are relieved. They whisper that the prince has matured, that his romantic follies have subsided, and that he will soon choose a suitable bride from among England's noble daughters. They mistake stillness for stability, not seeing that in his silence lies a growing disconnection from purpose. Thelma notices it sometimes, the way his eyes wander even in conversation, as though listening for something beyond the room. Yet she says nothing. Perhaps she senses that words would only scatter the fragile calm he clings to. She, too, is aging into caution. Edward retreats more often to his country residence at Fort Belvedere, a place he fills with modern furnishings, jazz records, and the company of trusted friends. Thelma visits often, and together they read, play records, and take long walks beneath the pale winter sun. The prince confides in her about his dreams of a simpler life, a farm perhaps, or a modest home by the sea, far from ceremony and expectation. She listens, smiling gently, knowing such wishes belong to the realm of fantasy. Yet for a fleeting moment when he speaks of freedom, she can almost believe it might be possible. In the world beyond their solitude, history is shifting. The depression deepens. Unemployment spreads through the north of England. Crowds queue for bread, and the old certainties of empire begin to fray. Still, within the walls of the palace, the prince's life moves with ritual precision, a dance choreographed by unseen hands. The newspapers, eager for inspiration, continue to call him the People's Prince. He embodies the illusion of connection, a figure both glamorous and tragic, unaware that his own loneliness mirrors the weariness of his nation. One evening, while attending a charity gala, Edward catches sight of a painting, a simple portrait of a shepherd tending his flock beneath an English sky. He stands before it longer than expected, the crowd swirling around him like mist. The image moves him deeply, not for its artistry, but for its peace. "That man," he murmurs to Thelma beside him, "is freer than I shall ever be." She touches his arm lightly and whispers, "Perhaps freedom isn't in the fields, Edward, but in finding a reason to stay." He nods, though neither truly believes it. As months pass, rumors begin to circulate that the prince's affection for Thelma may soon lead to scandal. Yet the truth is gentler, more melancholic. Their bond, though intimate, remains bound by unspoken restraint. Thelma, wise enough to understand the limits of their world, begins to withdraw, encouraging Edward to look beyond her, to duty, to future, to whatever solace he might find in purpose. Her departure from his heart is not abrupt, but gradual, like the fading of sunlight through mist. When she leaves for America to tend to family affairs, he sees her off at the train station. The moment lingers in quiet dignity, a brief kiss upon the hand, a smile heavy with unspoken farewell. Without her, Fort Belvedere feels hollow. The records gather dust, the laughter once shared dissolves into silence. Edward writes her letters, short, formal, restrained, and she replies with equal politeness, both knowing that their affection has become another relic of an age already fading. It is during these quiet years that the prince begins to realize how little of his life belongs to him. Without love's rebellion, without companionship's fire, his days flatten into ceremonial endurance. He grows dutiful, even conscientious, yet inside him something quietly withers. The narrator's voice lowers to a thoughtful murmur. History often praises those who act, but it forgets those who endure. Edward becomes one of the latter, a man who performs the motions of destiny while his heart drifts elsewhere, unreachable. The world sees a dutiful prince preparing to reign. Only he feels the emptiness of a life unlived. The lords of the realm take comfort in his compliance, not realizing that in binding him to duty, they have unmoored his soul. By the late 1930s, the prince is nearing 40, and whispers of marriage grow louder. Names are suggested, young women of noble birth, each more proper than the last. But none capture his imagination. He speaks little of love now. To his advisers, he is polite but detached, his tone neither defiant nor enthusiastic, as though the subject itself has lost meaning. Those who remember his youthful charm notice the change, his laughter shorter, his eyes more distant, his posture increasingly heavy with thought. And so, without scandal, without exile, and without Wallis Simpson, the future king walks steadily toward a throne that will offer him everything but happiness. The path he takes is calm, measured, and utterly lonely. He is a man drifting through the rituals of destiny, like a boat guided by unseen currents, his compass lost somewhere in the fog of what might have been. The music softens, the narrator pauses. "When love is denied the chance to test us," he whispers, "duty becomes its own kind of exile." The sound of a distant clock echoes once more, and as the last chime fades, a new dawn begins to glow upon the horizon, the beginning of choices that will shape the monarchy's uncertain peace. Across the Atlantic, the rhythm of life unfolds with a quieter pulse. The year is 1932, and in the drawing rooms of Baltimore, Wallis Warfield Simpson stands at a window overlooking a street lined with bare winter trees. She has returned to America with her husband Ernest after several years abroad. Her English experiment of glamour and ambition concluded not in scandal, but in weariness. The newspapers no longer print her name, and London society has already moved on. To those who remember her, she is another American socialite who came, smiled, and faded, graceful, witty, but ultimately forgettable. Yet within her heart there remains that restless flicker, the sense that she was meant for something larger than the polite quiet of domestic life. She spends her mornings writing letters to friends in Europe, her afternoons shopping or hosting modest luncheons. Ernest is attentive in his way, steady and unimaginative, the kind of man whose predictability can feel like both comfort and confinement. Their marriage is not unhappy, but it is airless, a polite arrangement built upon shared civility rather than passion. On Sundays, they drive into the countryside, and Wallis watches the landscape blur past with a distant expression, her mind somewhere far beyond the horizon. She cannot articulate what it is she longs for, only that life feels unfinished, as though a chapter has been left unwritten. In another world, she would have met the prince by now. Her sharp humor and audacious confidence would have drawn his attention, and their forbidden romance would have consumed both their fates. But in this quieter reality, that meeting never occurs, and so the great flame never ignites. Wallis remains a woman of small parties, quiet gossip, and fading invitations. Sometimes, late at night, she looks into the mirror and studies the face staring back, a face both beautiful and ordinary, marked not by destiny, but by time. "Perhaps," she whispers once, "some lives are meant only to brush the edges of history, not to burn through its heart." Meanwhile, London continues without her. The name Simpson does not echo through the corridors of Buckingham Palace. No scandal trembles across the headlines. The prince, unaware of what has been averted, continues his slow drift toward duty. The empire remains steady, unshaken by the tempest that never was. Yet there is a strange symmetry to it all. Across two continents, two souls feel the same quiet discontent, each imprisoned by circumstance, each haunted by a sense of something left undone. The narrator's voice softens, drawing us closer. History does not always change with the noise of revolution. Sometimes it changes through silence, through the lives that never collide, the words never spoken, the eyes that never meet. Wallis lives on in modest comfort, her ambitions tempered by reality. She takes to writing small columns for fashion magazines, her wit still sharp, her sentences laced with irony. Readers enjoy her charm, never guessing that beneath her lively tone lies a deep melancholy, a yearning for significance denied. By 1935, America has entered the depths of the Great Depression. Bread lines stretch through city streets, and even the wealthy tighten their purses. Wallis adjusts gracefully, as she always does, learning to make elegance from simplicity. Yet as the years pass, she senses that her life is folding inward. Her world has become smaller. Friends lost to distance, letters fewer, her laughter less spontaneous. Occasionally, she receives word from London. Thelma Furness writes now and then, describing royal functions, garden parties, and the prince's charm. Wallis reads the letters with faint amusement, unaware that she herself might once have stood in those glittering rooms. She imagines the prince as Thelma describes him, courteous, shy, a little distant. "A pity," she writes in reply, "that the finest men are always the loneliest." In the quiet of her home, she sometimes dreams of England, not as it truly was, but as a shimmering stage upon which she might have performed. In those dreams she walks through halls of marble and gold, her laughter echoing softly as unseen eyes follow her. But when morning comes, the dream dissolves like mist, leaving behind only the ticking of the clock and the faint scent of yesterday's perfume. She turns away from the mirror and resumes her day, her heart steady, her imagination undisturbed by what might have been. Back in London, Thelma grows older, too, her beauty mellowing into grace. She continues her friendship with the now-crowned King Edward VIII, though it is a friendship marked by quiet formality rather than passion. She knows the limits of her place in his world and has long accepted them. Sometimes, when she writes to Wallis, she wonders idly what might have come of things had she made that introduction, had she not canceled that small tea gathering all those years ago. But the thought passes quickly. History feels solid, immovable, and she is content to believe that everything unfolded as it was meant to. The narrator pauses, letting the quiet settle like dust upon old photographs. Fate, he muses, is not only the sum of our choices, but also of our forgetfulness. One missed appointment, one delayed letter, one hesitation, and the world tilts into a different pattern. As 1936 approaches, the tides of both continents shift once more. In Britain, the king's advisors begin pressing him toward marriage. In America, Wallis and Ernest relocate to New York, where the bright lights promise distraction but not fulfillment. She attends gatherings of expatriates, where the talk drifts between politics, fashion, and fading memories of London. Occasionally, someone mentions the British royal family, and she listens with detached curiosity, unaware that her own name was once written in the margins of that story, now erased, invisible. And so, as the world edges closer to another war, two lives that were once destined to collide continue apart, each moving within the narrow lanes prescribed by chance. The empire stands, the throne unshaken, the newspapers calm. The great romance that might have set history ablaze remains unwritten, its embers sleeping beneath the surface of time. Yet, in that absence, there lingers a strange, quiet beauty, the sense that not all tragedies must be lived to be felt, and not all flames need to burn to give off light. The narrator's voice deepens to a whisper, like an echo fading into twilight. What becomes of a woman spared from her myth? And what becomes of the world that never learned her name? A gust of wind moves through the trees outside Wallis's window, scattering a few yellow leaves across the pavement. She watches them fall without expression, unaware that she has just passed beyond the reach of legend, and that history, in turning elsewhere, has left her standing still. By the spring of 1935, the loneliness surrounding Edward has begun to harden into habit. He rises each morning with the same disciplined ritual: letters, briefings, charity visits, a lunch shared with courtiers whose conversation never strays from polite trivialities. Thelma's absence has left a silence no music can fill, and though he carries himself with impeccable composure, there are moments when his eyes seem to wander beyond the present, toward a horizon he cannot name. The monarchy, long fearful of his whims, now finds comfort in his restraint. His rebellion, once so eagerly anticipated by a restless public, has dimmed into obedience. It is in this atmosphere of calm expectation that whispers begin to spread within courtly circles. It is time, they say, for the prince to marry. The search for a suitable bride becomes a matter of quiet urgency. Behind closed doors, ministers and family advisors draw up names of noblewomen deemed appropriate. daughters of dukes, granddaughters of earls, each with impeccable lineage and the kind of temperament thought to steady a king. Edward, however, is indifferent. He listens to the suggestions with the patience of a man being fitted for a suit he will never wear. The notion of marriage, to him, feels like another crown, another weight to be borne in silence. And yet, beneath his detachment, there lingers a faint ache for companionship, for a voice in the vast halls of his solitude. It is during this time that fate, ever curious, ever watchful, arranges another meeting. At a charity concert for war widows, Edward is introduced to Lady Alexandra Howard, a woman of gentle grace and quiet intelligence. She's 26, well-educated, and possessed of a calm dignity that immediately disarms him. Her beauty is not the striking kind that draws every gaze, but rather the kind that endures, the beauty of composure, of empathy. When they speak, her voice carries neither the tremor of awe nor the stiffness of formality. She speaks to him as one human being to another, unafraid of his title, untempted by his crown. For the first time in years, Edward feels seen not as a symbol, but as a man. Their acquaintance begins modestly, luncheons, shared rides, evenings spent discussing art and music. Alexandra's manner is gentle, yet her understanding of his restlessness runs deep. She listens without judgment when he confesses his disillusionment with royal life, his longing for something ordinary. She tells him that perhaps there is nobility even in endurance, that not all prisons are built of walls, and not all freedoms lie beyond them. Her words linger with him long after she has left the room. The newspapers soon take notice, and society begins to hum with anticipation. At last, the headlines declare, the prince may have found his future queen. The courtiers are pleased. The royal household relaxes. To them, Alexandra seems the perfect solution, a woman of grace and loyalty who might steady the heart of a man too long adrift. And in truth, Edward feels something resembling peace in her company. He finds her presence restful, her laughter like a quiet melody that fills the empty corners of his life. When he looks at her, he sees not passion but promise, not rebellion but refuge. The engagement is announced in early 1936. The public greets it with joy and relief. The monarchy, long shadowed by uncertainty, appears once more unassailable. The wedding, held that summer at Westminster Abbey, unfolds with all the splendor tradition can command. Crowds line the streets, waving flags beneath a pale blue sky. Bells ring across London, echoing through the city's ancient stones. The bride, radiant in ivory silk, walks slowly down the aisle as Edward waits at the altar, his expression solemn and composed. The ceremony is perfect in every visible way, yet within the silence of his heart a faint echo stirs, a question he cannot quite silence. Is this peace or surrender? When they emerge from the abbey as husband and wife, the cheers of the people rise like a tide. For a moment he allows himself to believe that this union might redeem him, that duty, softened by affection, could yet become a form of freedom. In Alexandra's calm gaze he finds reassurance, though not fire. He realizes that she loves him not for what he might have been, but for what he already is, a man caught between longing and obligation. It is, perhaps, the only kind of love that the throne will allow. Their early years together pass in quiet harmony. Alexandra brings warmth to the royal household, her kindness earning the affection of both staff and subjects. She supports his charitable efforts, visits the sick, and brings grace to every public appearance. Edward, now King Edward VIII after his father's passing, seems at last settled into his role. The public adores their modern, dignified monarch and his gentle queen. Photographs of them strolling through gardens or smiling at children become symbols of a nation's renewed faith in stability. The empire, though strained by economic hardship, takes comfort in their composure. And yet, beneath the calm surface of this new chapter, something subtle begins to shift. Edward finds himself gazing out of palace windows at twilight, watching the lamplight shimmer across the Thames. He feels gratitude for Alexandra, but also distance. Her serenity, once so healing, now feels like glass, clear but untouchable. They rarely quarrel. They rarely laugh as well. Their marriage becomes a model of dignity, but not intimacy. In another world, Wallis's laughter might have startled him into life. Here, Alexandra's kindness lulls him into gentleness. It is a better fate, perhaps, but a quieter one. The narrator's voice slows, weighted with reflection. History, he murmurs, is often shaped not by those who burn, but by those who endure. In this gentler world, the crown remains upon his head, but its thorns still press against his heart. The scene fades, the king and queen at a balcony, waving to the crowds below. The cheers rise, but Edward's gaze drifts somewhere beyond them, toward a horizon none can see. The sun sets behind the palace, its light fading into gold and shadow. The music swells softly, then dims, and in that lingering dusk, one truth glimmers quietly beneath the surface of triumph, that even in salvation there is loss, that the world spared of scandal has also been spared of passion. The year is 1937, and the bells of Westminster have barely ceased echoing before the crown begins to weigh upon Edward's brow. The coronation has passed with all its ancient splendor, robes heavy with gold thread, oaths whispered in the shadow of history, the organ's solemn thunder filling the abbey as a nation looked on with reverence and relief. Yet within that grand pageant, the king feels strangely absent, as though the moment belonged to everyone but himself. Alexandra, his new queen, stands beside him with calm grace, her face radiant but unreadable. Together they seem the image of modern monarchy, dignified, stable, respectable. And yet in the quiet after-ceremony, Edward senses how still the world has become, how the echoes of his own heart have faded into duty's silence. Without the scandal of abdication, Britain enters a decade of apparent calm. The monarchy is unblemished, the newspapers respectful, the public content. The image of King Edward VIII and Queen Alexandra becomes a reassuring emblem of continuity in uncertain times. Yet behind palace doors, the king's restlessness endures. He performs his duties diligently, signing documents, attending state functions, delivering speeches crafted to sound both human and regal. But he knows they are not his words, not his thoughts. They belong to the machine of governance that moves around him. His voice, once filled with youthful charm and conviction, grows careful, deliberate, cautious. Even his gestures change, his once impulsive warmth now measured into formality. The monarchy's advisors praise this transformation. They say he has matured into kingship, that Alexandra's influence has brought wisdom to his reign. And indeed, the queen's gentle diplomacy softens many edges. She becomes beloved by the public for her warmth and quiet strength, her charity visits, her compassion toward the poor. Yet her kindness, while healing to the people, deepens Edward's sense of isolation. She moves through the world with certainty, her role clear, her purpose defined. He, the king, feels curiously displaced within his own life, like an actor repeating lines he has long since forgotten the meaning of. At times, he walks alone through the palace corridors at night, the echo of his steps following him like a question. Outside, the city hums with modern energy, motor cars racing through fog, jazz drifting from riverside clubs, lights reflecting on the wet cobblestones. It is a London transformed, moving toward a new age. But within the palace, time feels suspended, trapped between ceremony and memory. The king, once a symbol of modernity, now finds himself a guardian of tradition he no longer understands. Without the defiant fire that Wallis might have lit within him, he settles into obedience, the perfect monarch in the eyes of his ministers, predictable, cautious, and utterly human. His correspondence with Thelma continues intermittently. Her letters are affectionate but tinged with nostalgia, recalling the carefree years when they roamed the countryside in open cars and laughed at the absurdities of court life. "Do you ever miss those days?" she asks in one letter. He reads the words slowly, then sets the page aside. To admit that he does would be to admit that something within him has quietly died. Instead, he writes back only, "Those were simpler times. We must be grateful for peace." Peace, yes, but peace of what kind? The narrator's voice turns introspective, almost tender. Peace can cradle a man as gently as sleep, but it can also smother him just as surely. Edward's reign becomes defined by this paradox, outward stability masking inward retreat. He makes no great reforms, no bold declarations. His legacy, if one can call it that, becomes a stillness, a monarchy preserved by absence of controversy rather than presence of vision. And yet, for all his restraint, the people adore him. They see in him the image of reliability, a man who endured temptation and chose duty. They do not see the quiet melancholy beneath his polished smile. Queen Alexandra, for her part, senses his solitude but cannot penetrate it. She loves him in her patient, unwavering way, tending to his moods with quiet understanding. Yet their lives remain parallel rather than entwined, two figures moving gracefully through the same script but seldom touching the heart of it. On public occasions, their poise captivates the world. In private, their silences grow longer. They share kindness, but not confession. When she looks at him across the table, she sees not a husband but a man surrounded by ghosts, of youth, of lost freedom, of an undefined longing she can never satisfy. Outside the palace, Britain changes. The Great Depression loosens its grip. New technologies stir the imagination. There are radio broadcasts, film premieres, the first murmurs of political turmoil in Europe. Yet in every photograph, every newsreel, the king appears serene, a symbol of calm amidst global anxiety. The people believe him content, their faith in him unwavering. Perhaps the narrator muses, that is the true function of monarchy, to conceal the frailty of the man behind the endurance of the image. Sometimes, late at night, Edward retreats to his private study and plays an old phonograph record, music from the years when he was still the prince, still free. The notes drift softly through the dim room, mingling with the crackle of the fire. He closes his eyes and imagines what might have been had fate been less cautious, had life allowed him a love fierce enough to challenge him. Then, as the record ends, he opens his eyes and returns to his papers, signing decrees with the steady hand of a man resigned to history's mercy. The narrator pauses, his tone now barely above a whisper. "The crown remained unbroken," he says, "but the man beneath it was quietly lost." And so Britain enters the later 1930s under a monarch of perfect restraint. The newspapers speak of harmony, the empire endures, the royal image shines untarnished. Yet within the heart of the king, the silence deepens. He has achieved what his ancestors could not: peace without scandal, unity without rebellion, and yet in doing so, he has unknowingly traded the vitality of the human soul for the stillness of a statue. The empire, grateful for its calm, never asks what that calm has cost. Outside, the city sleeps beneath a thin veil of fog. A clock tolls somewhere beyond the river, its chime carried faintly on the night air. Within the palace, Edward sits alone by the dying fire, the reflection of its light glinting softly off the crown that rests in the glass case beside him. For a long moment, he watches it, the symbol of all he has preserved and all he has lost. Then, with a weary breath, he turns away, and so the night closes over him, and the empire sleeps, unaware that its peace has been bought not by love, but by silence. Across the ocean, the years move differently. The tempo of American life quickens, cities hum with the recovery from the Depression, and the glow of electric signs replaces the dim candlelight of the old world. Yet within the quiet rooms of a modest apartment in New York, Wallis Simpson moves through her days like an actress who has forgotten her lines but continues the performance out of instinct. Her husband, Ernest, remains dutiful and kind, though his affection has settled into routine. They dine with acquaintances, attend small gatherings, and exchange polite words before parting each night in courteous silence. Their life together is not unhappy, it is simply unremarkable. Sometimes, when she walks through the city streets, Wallis watches the crowds with an expression of faint amusement. She sees women in fine coats, men in crisp hats, couples laughing beneath the streetlights, and she imagines herself among them, not as a participant, but as an observer of a play in which she once might have had a starring role. There is still grace in her step, wit in her conversation, and a sparkle in her eyes when she chooses to display it. Yet there is something behind that sparkle now, a distance, a quiet resignation. She has learned the art of appearing fulfilled. At home, she collects magazines and photographs of European royalty, fascinated by their rituals and silks, their carefully staged smiles. She reads about King Edward V and his gentle Queen Alexandra, noting the stability that Britain has found under their reign. Sometimes she traces the pictures with her finger, not out of envy, but curiosity. "What a handsome couple," she murmurs, half to herself. "So calm, so inevitable." She wonders what the king, must be like in private. Does he still laugh freely? Does he find contentment in the quiet arms of duty? She suspects not. Though she has never met him, she senses in his eyes that same flicker of restlessness that once stirred in her own. In another life, their meeting would have been inevitable, their connection explosive, their love catastrophic. But that thread was never pulled. And so, instead of passion, there is only possibility, an idea that lives and dies within the boundaries of imagination. Wallis, though she does not know it, has been spared a legend and given an ordinary life. Yet she feels the faint ghost of what that legend might have been. At night, when the city quiets and the lights of Broadway fade into mist, she stands by the window and lets her mind wander. There, in that private darkness, she envisions another self, bold, radiant, defiant, standing beside a king as the world trembles in judgment. She can almost hear the distant applause and condemnation, the music of fate rising around her. Then she exhales softly, and the dream dissolves. Years pass like pages turned without notice. By 1939, Europe burns once more, and the headlines are filled with names that sound like omens: Hitler, Mussolini, Churchill. Wallis reads the papers each morning, the world suddenly smaller, more dangerous. She sees the photographs of London under threat, of Buckingham Palace illuminated by blackout curtains, and she feels a strange tug of sympathy for a place she has never truly belonged to. Perhaps it is nostalgia for the Europe of her youth, the salons, the laughter, the slow evenings filled with the scent of roses and cigarette smoke. Or perhaps it is something deeper, an echo of the life she never lived. The narrator's voice softens, like wind passing through lace curtains. "Sometimes," he murmurs, "the greatest tragedies are those that never happen, for they linger untested, perfect in their possibility." Wallis, spared from scandal, finds solace in small things. She takes up writing, short essays, reflections on fashion, fragments of memoir. Her words carry her wit and precision, but none of the fire she might have wielded had destiny chosen her. Readers enjoy her style, her detached humor, the effortless intelligence with which she observes the social world. "Mrs. Simpson has a way of seeing," one editor writes, as though she stands slightly apart from life itself. He does not realize how accurate that is. When the war engulfs Europe, Wallis becomes a quiet supporter of relief efforts, organizing charity events, collecting funds for the Red Cross. Her name appears occasionally in the society pages, but always in passing. She is respected, admired, forgotten, remembered again. Her life, once poised for drama, has become a graceful sequence of ordinary days, and yet in the silence between those days there remains the faint hum of destiny unfulfilled. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the king she never met walks the corridors of Windsor, the war pressing heavily upon his reign. The radio crackles with reports of bombings, the empire trembles, and the world holds its breath. But Wallis, unaware of the full weight of this history, simply listens from afar. She pours herself a cup of tea, turns the dial of her radio, and hears his voice, steady, deliberate, dignified. She does not know why, but the sound stirs her deeply. It is the voice of a man she has never known and never will, yet in its timbre there is something familiar, the sound of longing restrained by duty. For a brief moment she closes her eyes and imagines he is speaking to her, and her alone. Then, as the broadcast ends, she smiles faintly, sets her cup down, and whispers, "Poor man." Years will pass before she realizes that her compassion for him is also a form of love, one that requires no meeting, no scandal, no ruin. It is a love of understanding, of kinship through the quiet ache of what might have been. She will never write this truth, never speak it aloud, but sometimes, when she dreams, she will see him walking through mist, crownless and free, turning to smile at her as though they had known each other all their lives. The narrator's voice lingers over her image, older now, elegant still, standing before a mirror where time has softened her reflection. History, he says gently, remembers the flames that burned, but it forgets the embers that never caught. Yet even in shadow there is warmth. And so, Wallis Simpson, the woman who might have changed the world, fades quietly into history's periphery. No exile, no royal title, no whispered legend, only a quiet life, lived gracefully beneath the shade of what never came to pass. She will be remembered by those who meet her as charming, refined, and unknowable. And in the evenings, when the city sleeps and the lights dim to a golden haze, she will think, just once more, of the man she never met and of the door that never opened. By the end of 1938, a strange stillness hangs over Britain, like the breath held before a storm. The streets of London hum with a forced optimism, markets bustle, cinemas glow with light, and yet beneath the laughter there is unease, a tremor that even the music cannot conceal. Europe is changing, hardening, preparing itself for something dreadful and vast. Across the channel, the voice of Adolf Hitler echoes through the radios of ordinary homes, his words like thunder, rolling over the fields of history. The British newspapers, cautious and weary, speak of peace and diplomacy, but everyone can feel the tension rising, like water against a dam. And within Buckingham Palace, King Edward VIII sits alone at his desk, reading the morning dispatches with a furrowed brow, wondering which of the world's promises will collapse first. He has ruled now for 2 years, and the crown, though polished and steady, feels heavier than ever. His advisors speak to him of policy and defense, of alliances and caution, yet his heart, once restless for freedom, is now restless for meaning. The gentle Queen Alexandra moves gracefully through her duties, her calm presence a balm to a nervous nation, but even she cannot quiet the unease that clouds his thoughts. Edward's nature has always leaned towards sympathy and idealism. He sees in Hitler not only the shadow of tyranny, but the echo of his own youthful longing for strength, for change, for something that feels alive. He knows the danger, yet he is drawn to the illusion of control that such power represents. His ministers tread carefully around this truth, fearful of what his naive curiosity might awaken. The narrator's voice softens. Even in the absence of passion's rebellion, history finds its tremors. A single decision denied does not quiet the soul. It only redirects its hunger. Azabs, in this alternate world, without Wallis to mirror his defiance, Edward's doubts take a different shape. They turn inward. He begins to question the machinery of politics, the sincerity of his ministers, the emptiness of the words he must speak. To the public, he is still the reassuring figure of monarchy, the king who smiles, who visits the wounded, who shakes hands with minors and schoolchildren. But behind the photographs lies a mind increasingly torn between the weight of peace and the whisper of power. At night, he walks the palace gardens alone, his footsteps muffled by the damp grass, his thoughts drawn toward the flickering lights across Europe. The air smells of rain and coal smoke, and somewhere in the distance the faint hum of airplanes drifts through the sky. He pauses beneath an oak tree, looking toward the dark horizon. If only they understood, he whispers to himself, though he is not sure who he means. His people, his government, or his own heart. He longs for a truth that feels larger than ceremony, larger than diplomacy, and yet he fears the cost of pursuing it. In another life, Wallis would have been the voice to challenge him, to question his sympathies, to temper his romanticism with her sharp realism. She would have warned him against the seduction of strong men, against the dangers of seeing charm where there is cruelty. But in this quieter reality, there is no one to hold that mirror up to him. Alexandra, devoted and gentle, never contradicts him. She believes that peace, even an uneasy one, is better than confrontation. And so, within the palace, conversations about Germany grow cautious and incomplete, and the man who might have abdicated for love now risks his legacy through indecision. The people, however, do not see this inner struggle. They see only a king who appears calm, reasonable, and kind. They cannot hear the silence that follows him through the corridors of Windsor, nor the restless scratching of his pen across papers he cannot bring himself to sign. He writes letters to foreign leaders, drafts speeches he never delivers, starts journals he never finishes. The weight of leadership becomes a mirror of the emptiness he has always felt, a burden without resolution. The narrator's tone deepens. When destiny is denied its fire, it finds another form, cold, disciplined, and no less dangerous. The king who refused to break for love now bends beneath the illusion of reason. By early 1939, the illusion of peace collapses. Germany invades Czechoslovakia, and Britain's patience snaps. The cabinet presses for rearmament, for readiness, for courage. Edward listens, pale and still, while his ministers speak of alliances and sacrifice. He nods, agrees, signs where he must, but inside, something withdraws. He cannot summon the conviction his brother, George, might have had in another world. His words to the nation, broadcast over the wireless in tones of calm reassurance, sound composed but hollow. The people sense it, though they cannot name it. His is a voice of intelligence, not of faith. In private, Alexandra urges him to rest. She tells him that his conscience is his greatest strength, that the nation trusts him because he doubts himself. But in her words, he hears only the echo of kindness, not belief. One evening, as she reads by the fire, he watches her in silence and wonders whether he has failed her, or whether history itself has failed them both by trapping them in a story too small for their humanity. As spring turns to summer, London blooms in defiance of the gathering dark. The parks are filled with families, the air with the promise of another golden season, yet everyone feels the approaching storm. Soldiers march through the streets in quiet columns. Children practice air raid drills in schools. The empire braces itself, and Edward, the king who once dreamed of escape, realizes there is nowhere left to flee. He stands at the palace window one evening as the sun dips behind the skyline, the light fading into rose and gray. "Perhaps this is what it means to reign," he murmurs, "to stand still while the world burns around you." The music fades into the sound of distant thunder. The narrator's voice returns, low and reflective. The storm that love might have prevented comes now in another form, not of hearts in turmoil, but of nations. and once again the crown must choose between silence and the peril of conviction. The first sirens of war will sound soon. The king, who once sought meaning and affection and found only duty, will now be tested by history itself. Whether he will endure, or whether his quiet indecision will become the monarchy's undoing, no one yet knows. The world waits, holding its breath. When the first bombs fall upon London, the city does not scream. It exhales. The sound is less terror than inevitability, as though a long-deferred reckoning has finally arrived. September 1939. War, the word itself, has the weight of prophecy, and for King Edward VIII, it carries a heaviness beyond politics. From the windows of Buckingham Palace, he watches the searchlight sweep across the night sky, slicing through the darkness in long silver arcs. The thunder of anti-aircraft guns echoes through the city like some ancient heartbeat, and the king, once restless for meaning, now feels the awful nearness of it. The illusion of calm that had defined his reign vanishes overnight. There is no longer room for hesitation, yet even as the nation rallies around him, Edward feels that strange, familiar emptiness, a hollow space where conviction should reside. He speaks to his people through the radio, his voice measured, solemn, touched with a gentleness that soothes rather than inspires. "We face this trial together," he says, his words deliberate, his tone that of a man reading from his soul rather than a page. "We shall stand with courage, for courage is the heart of peace." The speech receives praise across Britain, but those who listen closely hear something else, a trace of fragility, a wistfulness beneath the calm. His words reassure but do not ignite. They comfort but do not command. The people love their king, yet some whisper that he is not a wartime monarch, that his compassion, once endearing, now borders on uncertainty. Within the palace, tension mounts. His ministers, led by Churchill, grow impatient with his caution. The king's natural aversion to conflict manifests as reluctance to sanction certain military operations, his belief in diplomacy lingering like a ghost in a world that no longer believes in words. Alexandra, ever loyal, pleads for understanding, urging him to trust his advisors. But Edward finds it difficult to yield. He cannot reconcile the brutality of war with the morality he has always sought to embody. To him, victory without righteousness feels like defeat, yet he also knows that righteousness alone will not save lives. The paradox tears at him quietly, unseen but relentless. The narrator's voice becomes hushed, almost mournful. He who once fled from love's turmoil now finds himself trapped in a conflict that offers no escape. The war he must fight is not upon the fields of Europe, but within the chambers of his own conscience. Nights grow longer. The palace shakes under distant blasts, its grand ceilings shedding faint clouds of dust with each tremor. Edward insists on remaining in London, refusing to evacuate to Windsor despite the government's urging. He walks among the ruins after raids, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat, stopping to speak with the wounded and the grieving. There, among the broken bricks and the courage of ordinary people, he feels closest to something like grace. When a mother hands him the charred toy of her child lost to the fires, he holds it with trembling hands and cannot speak. The silence that follows becomes the truest act of his reign. Alexandra, radiant even in fatigue, becomes the heart of the nation. Her calm presence in hospitals and shelters earns her the devotion that her husband cannot command. Where he hesitates, she comforts. Where he doubts, she endures. The people adore her quiet heroism, and newspapers begin to speak of the Queen's War. Edward, reading the headlines each morning, feels both pride and shame. He knows she has become what he could not, a symbol of unwavering courage. And yet, instead of jealousy, he feels only gratitude. Perhaps, he tells her one evening, it is better that one of us can still believe without question. She smiles softly, touches his hand, and answers, "Belief is not absence of doubt, my love. It is the will to walk through it." Her words stay with him long after she has gone to bed, echoing through the long corridors of the palace like a gentle hymn. As months pass into years, the weight of command begins to reshape him. The softness that once defined him hardens into quiet resolve. He no longer questions the necessity of the war, but he remains haunted by its toll. Every telegram that reaches his desk, every report of casualties, feels like a personal failure. He dreams of soldiers calling to him from the fog, their faces half seen, their voices filled with both accusation and forgiveness. He wakes before dawn, unable to rest, and walks through the palace gardens as if the dew itself could absolve him. The narrator reflects, "Some rulers find glory in conquest. Others find peace in surrender. But the rarest kind are those who learn to carry both within them, to lead without faith, to hope without illusion." In 1941, during one of the war's darkest winters, the king collapses briefly during a broadcast rehearsal. Exhaustion, the doctors say, overwork. But those close to him know it is not the body that fails. It is the spirit strained by the ceaseless conflict between empathy and necessity. For days, he remains confined to his chambers, writing in a private journal that no one will ever read. "It is strange," he writes, "to rule in a time when mercy feels like treason. Perhaps all kings must choose which part of their soul to keep intact. I have chosen the gentler half, though I fear it may destroy me." Alexandra visits him daily, sitting by the window while he writes. Sometimes she reads aloud from scripture or poetry, her voice soft and low. She does not speak of duty or expectation. She simply remains beside him, and in that quiet companionship, he finds something close to redemption. For a brief moment, the weight of the crown feels lighter, as though shared. When he finally returns to public life, his face is thinner, his hair touched with silver. The people, unaware of the depth of his struggle, cheer as loudly as ever. They see in him a figure of endurance, not realizing how fragile that endurance has become. The king who once drifted through life has learned at last to stand still, not because he is certain, but because the world needs him to be. The narrator pauses, letting the silence settle like falling ash. "War," he murmurs, "reveals the measure of a man not by his victories, but by his willingness to remain human amid necessity." By 1943, the tide of the war begins to turn, though its cost is staggering. London still bears its scars, and the king, standing once more at the palace balcony, gazes over the city's darkened sprawl. The bells ring faintly in the distance, their sound fragile yet enduring. Alexandra joins him, slipping her arm through his. For a long time, they say nothing. The wind carries the scent of rain and smoke. Then, almost as a whisper, Edward says, "When this ends, I wonder if anything of us will remain." She turns to him and answers, "Yes, what has been lost is only noise. What remains is what we were meant to be." The camera of time lingers on that image, the weary king and the steadfast queen, two figures silhouetted against a wounded skyline, their faces half lit by the memory of hope. History, for now, keeps its distance, watching as they endure, fragile yet unbroken, the quiet embodiment of a nation's persistence. By the time the winter of 1943 fades into a pale, uncertain spring, the city of London has become a monument of resilience and ruin. Streets once bright with laughter now carry the scent of smoke and damp stone, and every citizen bears some mark of loss. Amid the wreckage, the monarchy remains, steady in appearance, fragile in truth. King Edward walks through bombed streets where the walls stand like broken teeth against the gray sky, offering words of comfort that sound rehearsed even to himself. He means every syllable, yet meaning no longer feels enough. Behind his calm demeanor lies a question that will not rest. What is a king's worth in an age when courage belongs to the common man? At first, it is only a murmur, an unease that grows in the corners of conversation. The king, they say, is too hesitant, too inward. His compassion, once his greatest virtue, now seems indecision. The ministers, already wary of his moral caution, begin to act more freely, steering policy without seeking his counsel. Churchill, with his fierce will and thunderous words, fills the void the monarch cannot occupy. The people turn their eyes toward the prime minister, whose certainty shines where the king's faith flickers. Edward senses this quiet shift, though no one dares to name it in his presence. He knows he has become a symbol of endurance rather than leadership, a mirror reflecting the nation's suffering, not its strength. The narrator's tone softens into a mournful calm. There are two kinds of kings, those who rule by conviction and those who reign by silence. Edward, once born for grandeur, has become the latter, yet even silence, when endured with grace, becomes a kind of truth. Within the palace, the queen works tirelessly, a steady flame amid the gathering fog. Alexandra visits hospitals, oversees relief efforts, and comforts mothers whose sons will never return. She has learned to navigate the distance between compassion and duty with the ease of breathing. The people adore her, not because she commands them, but because she listens. It is said that her voice alone could quiet the trembling of the heart, and yet the more she shines, the more Edward recedes into shadow. He loves her deeply, though he sometimes feels that she no longer belongs entirely to him. She has become the nation's conscience, while he remains its burden. At night, he wanders through the palace library, rows of old books rising around him like silent witnesses. He reads the diaries of past monarchs, Henry's doubts, Victoria's loneliness, George's anxieties, and finds in them the same exhaustion that now grips his own soul. He wonders if kingship is not a destiny, but a slow erosion, a wearing down of spirit beneath the unrelenting tide of history. Sometimes he pauses before the mirror and studies his reflection. The face that stares back is familiar yet distant, older, grayer, marked by the quiet sorrow of endurance. "I am not unhappy," he tells himself softly, "but nor am I alive." By 1944, as the Allied victories mount and the war's end draws near, the monarchy begins to change in the eyes of the people. The throne, once a symbol of divine permanence, now seems almost human, vulnerable, fallible, dependent upon the goodwill of those who fight in the fields and factories. For the first time, Edward feels the distance between crown and citizen narrowing not by reverence, but by fatigue. He sees young men return from war, broken yet unbowed, and feels that they, not he, carry the real authority of the age. Their courage has no pageantry, no ritual. It is forged in pain and humility, and in that realization he finds both shame and awe. The queen urges him to take solace in what remains. "Your example," she tells him, "is not power, but presence." The people need to see that even those who doubt can still endure. Her faith in him is gentle but firm, and though her words comfort him, they also wound. He wishes he could believe, as she does, that endurance itself is redemption. Yet deep down he suspects that history will not remember patience, only passion. He has given his people peace where others might have offered glory, and he wonders which they will cherish more. The narrator's voice slows, resonant and distant. In the absence of failure, the world often forgets the quiet heroism of restraint. The king who avoided scandal has now avoided greatness as well, and that, too, is a kind of exile. When victory finally comes in 1945, the streets erupt with celebration. Flags wave from every window, and strangers embrace in the glow of deliverance. The king appears on the palace balcony beside the queen, his expression serene but tired. The crowd cheers wildly, unaware that behind his calm gaze lies not triumph but relief, a release from years of inward struggle. He raises his hand in salute, the gesture graceful yet subdued, while Alexandra smiles beside him, radiant and steadfast. For that moment, the nation believes again in unity, in the quiet dignity of survival. Yet when the cheers fade and the evening descends, Edward feels only the echo of what might have been. He knows that his reign, though preserved from scandal, will never be sung as legend. He has kept the crown intact, but in doing so, has lost the part of himself that once dared to dream beyond it. That night, as fireworks fade and silence returns to the city, Edward stands alone by the window. The sky glows faintly red from the dying lights of celebration. He thinks of those who never returned, of the letters he signed, of the faces he cannot forget. Then he thinks fleetingly of Wallis Simpson, the woman who in another life might have broken the crown and freed him from it. He imagines her somewhere across the ocean, living an ordinary life, untouched by history's cruelty. For the first time, he envies her peace. The narrator whispers, "There are victories that cost too much to celebrate, and there are defeats so quiet that they look like grace." And so, the war ends not with fanfare in Edward's heart, but with a sigh, a long exhalation of duty fulfilled and meaning unclaimed. The empire has survived. The monarchy stands. But beneath the surface of its unbroken glory lies a single, lingering truth, that no peace, however noble, can fill the silence left by a life unlived. The rain begins again outside, falling softly on the palace roof. The sound is steady, rhythmic, almost forgiving. The king listens, closes his eyes, and for the first time in years, allows himself to weep, not for his people, but for the man he might have been. Across the Atlantic, as victory banners flutter over American cities and the radio hums with news of Europe's renewal, Wallis Simpson finds herself once more among whispers of a world she thought had forgotten her. The year is 1946, and the war has redrawn the map of nations and souls alike. Her apartment in New York, filled with afternoon light and the faint scent of lilies, has become a sanctuary of gentility and distance. Ernest has grown older, quieter, his attention consumed by business and the slow routines of post-war life. Wallis moves through their days with practiced grace, organizing luncheons, attending gallery openings, sending notes to friends scattered across continents. Yet beneath her civility, there's a restless curiosity, a subtle vibration of something stirring again in the corridors of memory. The newspapers are full of Europe's ghosts and new beginnings. Photographs of King Edward VIII and Queen Alexandra appear often, him grayer, reserved, her poised and beloved. They are portrayed as the steady heart of a nation reborn from ashes. Wallis studies their images without bitterness, though not without thought. She sees in his expression a kind of quiet fatigue, the same gentle melancholy she had once glimpsed in herself. In another lifetime, she thinks, perhaps they might have understood one another better than anyone else in the world. Yet she feels no envy now, only a strange tenderness for the man she never met, but always somehow knew. One afternoon, while attending a luncheon for American-British relief charities, a journalist recognizes her name from a guest list and approaches her with courteous enthusiasm. He asks, with the charm and tact of a newspaperman who knows the limits of civility, whether she had ever met the king. Wallis smiles, that same precise and ambiguous smile that once disarmed the gossip of London salons, and answers simply, "No, I never had the honor. But I believe he was a man who felt deeply, and those are always rare." Her words make their way into the next day's column, where they are quoted beneath the headline, "American Socialite Reflects on Britain's Beloved King." To her mild surprise, the remark draws letters, some from strangers who thank her for her kindness, others from acquaintances abroad who remember her as a figure once near the edges of history. The world, it seems, has decided to remember her again, gently this time, without scandal. The narrator's voice lowers into the rhythm of reminiscence. History is a tide, and sooner or later, all things once lost return upon its waves, not always as they were, but as they are remembered. Invitations begin to arrive once more, first to charity galas, then to radio interviews, and eventually to a small column in a women's magazine. The editors admire her wit and refinement, her ability to speak with both irony and compassion. She writes about style, manners, and the art of dignity in uncertain times. Her words, while polished, carry an undercurrent of reflection. It is not what we are denied that shapes us, but how we live in its absence. Readers find comfort in her tone, unaware that every sentence carries the quiet wisdom of one who once stood at history's threshold and turned away. In time, her reputation softens from curiosity to respect. She becomes a fixture of polite society again, not notorious, not celebrated, but admired. Occasionally, she's asked to comment on matters of Europe, and she speaks of Britain with affection. "The English," she says once, "have a remarkable gift for suffering beautifully. Even their grief has posture." Her audience laughs softly, unaware that behind her charm lies a deep, unspoken empathy for a nation and a king who have paid dearly for their composure. As the years fold gently forward, Wallis takes on a new rhythm of life. She hosts quiet dinners, tends her small garden, and walks each morning through Central Park, where the sunlight filters through the trees like memory itself. She becomes a confidant to younger women navigating society, advising them with gentle humor. "Do not chase what dazzles," she tells one. "It burns quickly. Seek instead what endures." Few realize she is speaking as much to herself as to them. Across the ocean, Edward hears of her name again, faintly, through court whispers and diplomatic chatter. Someone mentions that Mrs. Simpson has become something of an essayist, that her observations are rather fine. He nods politely, but later, alone, he asks his secretary to find one of her pieces. When it arrives, a clipped page from an American magazine, he reads it slowly, tracing her words with his finger. There is a grace there, he recognizes, a sensibility that feels hauntingly familiar. The article ends with a single line that lingers. "We are not what history writes of us, but what we choose to remember." Edward closes the page and sits in silence. For the first time in many years, he smiles, not with joy, but with recognition. The narrator lingers on that moment, the air between two distant lives vibrating with unspoken connection. "Some souls," he says softly, "remain entwined not through passion, but through the echo of what might have been. They meet in memory, where no scandal can touch them, and no crown can divide." In the late 1940s, Wallis becomes an occasional speaker for Anglo-American goodwill events. Her poise and eloquence charm her audiences, and she becomes, without ever intending it, a quiet symbol of reconciliation, a woman who bridges worlds without belonging wholly to either. The irony is almost divine. The figure who once might have fractured an empire now helps, in her small way, to heal its distance. She laughs privately at the thought. Fate, she muses, has a fondness for symmetry. One evening, as she returns home from a charity dinner, she pauses by her window and looks out across the city. The streets glow beneath her, alive and endless. Somewhere, she imagines, the king stands before his own window, gazing upon another skyline, both of them caught in the stillness of parallel solitude. The war has ended, yet peace, she realizes, is not the absence of struggle. It is the quiet acceptance of what remains when struggle has passed. The narrator's tone deepens to a hush. Wallis had once been meant to set the world aflame. Instead, she became its ember, steady, warm, and quietly luminous. As the night stretches onward, she turns from the window and sits at her writing desk. Her pen moves slowly, deliberately, as though tracing not sentences but the outline of memory itself. She writes only one line before stopping, reading it back with a small, wistful smile. Had we met, perhaps we might have ruined each other, but in not meeting, we have preserved what was best in both. She tears the page gently, folds it, and tucks it inside a drawer. Outside, New York glimmers like a constellation of what-ifs, and in one of those shining points, history pauses, quiet, content, and irrevocably changed. By the winter of 1949, the war has ended, but its shadow still clings to Europe like a fog that refuses to lift. London stands proud yet weary, rebuilt in body but not in spirit. The grand avenues gleam again, but beneath their brightness lies a hollowness, a fatigue of victory. The empire, stretched and frayed, feels its age. Across India, Africa, and the Caribbean, independence stirs like dawn beneath closed curtains. The world is changing, and with each passing season, the crown seems a little heavier, its gleam a little duller. In Buckingham Palace, King Edward VIII watches these transformations with the distant calm of a man who has seen too much and felt too little. The fire that once might have made him defiant has long gone out. What remains is endurance, refined into habit. His ministers, once deferential, now regard him with a cautious patience reserved for relics of a gentler era. They speak to him of reconstruction, of decolonization, of alliances across oceans. He listens, nods, and signs where he must, though his thoughts wander elsewhere, to quieter years, to roads untaken, to the soft echo of laughter that has not been heard in decades. The Queen remains his steadfast companion, her devotion unwavering, her calm unbroken. Yet even between them, the silences grow deeper. There is affection, but no longer conversation, companionship, but no longer discovery. Their love has become the kind born not of passion, but of shared endurance, and while the world admires it, both know it is built upon resignation. The narrator's voice, now aged and almost sorrowful, murmurs, "The crown was unbroken, but so too was the stillness that had wrapped his soul. To preserve the throne, he had preserved nothing of himself." Whispers begin to circulate within the government that the king is no longer fit for the demands of a changing world. His reticence, once praised as dignity, is now seen as paralysis. In Parliament and in drawing rooms alike, the question is raised, should there not be a monarch more attuned to the times, a younger voice, a steadier conviction? Few dare to speak the thought aloud, but the notion grows, quiet and persistent, like ivy creeping along a forgotten wall. Edward hears these murmurs, though no one speaks them to his face. He does not protest. He has come to understand that time itself has moved beyond him, and that he has become, quite without malice or tragedy, a man out of step with history. In the spring of 1950, his health begins to falter. The strain of years spent balancing the demands of conscience and state has taken its toll. His doctors recommend rest, but the king refuses to withdraw entirely from his duties. "If I am to fade," he says softly to Alexandra, "let it be among the pages I was given, not in the margins." She takes his hand and presses it gently, her eyes filled with the sadness of one who knows that love cannot protect against inevitability. It is not illness that defeats him, but weariness, the slow, inward erosion of a spirit that has carried too much restraint for too long. His speeches become shorter, his appearances rarer. The people, still fond of him, begin to look to the future. His younger brother, Albert, Duke of York, now a respected statesman in his own right, becomes the quiet alternative whispered in political corridors. When at last Edward announces his intention to step down, the world does not erupt in shock. It only sighs, as though something long expected has at last come to pass. He abdicates not for love this time, but for exhaustion. The act is met with solemn gratitude, not scandal. The newspapers write of his dignified retreat, his graceful conclusion to a reign of quiet fortitude. He delivers one final broadcast to his people, his voice calm, even tender. "I have sought," he says, "not to be great, but to be good. History will decide if I have succeeded, but I hope that, in my failure, you have found something of yourselves." The words linger in the air long after the transmission ends. For the first time, perhaps, he has spoken freely, not as monarch or symbol, but as man. After the broadcast, he walks through the gardens of Windsor with Alexandra. The late sun casts a pale gold over the lawns, the light soft as memory. They walk slowly, saying little. When they reach the old oak tree that had stood since his childhood, he stops and looks upward into its branches. "Strange," he murmurs, "how I have been surrounded by beauty all my life and still never learned how to belong to it." She takes his arm and rests her head against his shoulder, and for a moment the years of distance dissolve. In the months that follow his abdication, Edward retires quietly to the countryside, to a small estate overlooking gentle hills and fields. He spends his days reading, writing brief reflections that no one will ever publish, and watching the slow passage of seasons. Visitors describe him as serene, even content, though they note a kind of faraway look in his eyes, as though he sees beyond the horizon into some place only memory can reach. The Queen remains by his side, her loyalty unchanged, her own radiance undimmed. Their life becomes simple, measured, almost monastic. The world moves on without them. The narrator pauses, his voice now tinged with reverence. And so ends the reign that never fell, the love that never burned, the destiny that was never tested. History will not mourn him with scandal, nor crown him with glory. It will remember him only as a man who did his duty when the cost was his heart. Some years later, after his passing, his journals are found, fragments of thought written in a hand both steady and fragile. Among them is a line that catches the light, like a truth whispered across time. "The truest loyalty is not to the crown, but to the silence one keeps when the world no longer listens." Far away in America, Wallis reads of his death in the papers. The photograph accompanying the article shows him older, thinner, yet still possessed of that same distant grace. She sits in her garden beneath the soft rustle of leaves and reads the words aloud, "His Majesty King Edward VIII, remembered for his quiet strength and enduring humanity." She folds the paper slowly, lays it upon her lap, and closes her eyes. For a long while she does not move. Then, with a voice barely more than a breath, she says, "He found his peace after all." And for the first time in many years, she smiles, not for what was, but for what might have been spared. In the calm that follows the turning of empires, the world grows quieter, slower, softer. The Britain that once commanded oceans now moves through history with gentler steps. Its colonies, one by one, loosen their bonds, their flags rising beneath the same sun that once shone over the empire's reach. In this new world, the memory of King Edward VIII fades into gentility, neither saint nor sinner, simply a man who did what time demanded of him, and little more. The newspapers mention him only occasionally, his death marked by respectful brevity, his life summarized by words such as duty, grace, and restraint. In the public mind, he becomes an emblem of another age, not the age of scandal and abdication as history once knew, but of endurance without brilliance, of light that never flared too high. For Queen Alexandra, widowhood comes as a long twilight rather than a sudden night. She remains in their quiet estate by the river, where the fields breathe in soft rhythms, and the air carries the scent of grass and memory. Her days are measured by the changing of seasons, the first frost, the bloom of the wisteria, the rustle of summer rain against the windows. Visitors come often, courtiers and family members who still see her as a living link to gentler times. They find her kind, reflective, her voice carrying a wisdom untouched by bitterness. "He was a good man," she tells them when they ask about Edward, "perhaps too good for the age he ruled." And then, with that calm smile that has become her armor, she adds, "He gave the world peace, though not himself." Sometimes at dusk, she sits in the garden beneath the old oak where they once walked together and watches the river move past with the quiet persistence of time. There is a peace in her solitude, but also a faint ache, an awareness that what endures is not love's fire but its ashes. The wind carries faint echoes of church bells from a distant village, and she whispers to the evening air, "We were the calm after every storm." And the river, ever impartial, continues its endless flowing, as though agreeing in silence. Across the Atlantic, the story unfolds differently. Wallis Simpson, now in her 60s, lives in a modest townhouse shaded by elms. The light of New York, bright, ambitious, ever hungry, has dimmed in her eyes, replaced by something more inward, more forgiving. She has outlived much of the gossip that once followed her and has become, in her quiet way, a relic of an age that never was. Her essays have long since ceased publication, yet letters from strangers still arrive. Women who find courage in her poise, men who admire her candor. She answers only a few, always politely, never intimately. In truth, she has little left to say that the world could understand. There are moments, though, when her past brushes gently against her present, like the hem of a familiar garment. Once, while attending a small reception, she meets a young English diplomat who speaks warmly of the late king. "He was my grandfather's sovereign," he tells her, unaware of who she truly is beyond the faintly familiar name. A quiet man, but remembered kindly. Wallis smiles, tilting her head slightly as though considering the remark. "Kindness," she replies softly, "is often the last word left to those who lived without joy." The diplomat frowns, uncertain, and she changes the subject with a grace learned over decades. Yet when she returns home that night, she cannot shake the feeling that somewhere across the sea, a door long closed has just whispered open for a moment before vanishing again. Her nights grow reflective. She takes to writing again, though not for publication, only for herself. In a small leather-bound notebook, she records fragments of thought, neither confession nor regret. "We live," she writes, "in 1,000 possible lives, but only one of them becomes real. The others remain within us like folded letters never sent." In another entry, "Had I met him, I would have loved him fiercely, and it would have destroyed us both. Perhaps that is why fate, in its strange mercy, kept us apart." These pages remain hidden, tucked away in a drawer beside the photograph of her younger self, a woman poised, defiant, unknowingly standing on the threshold of an empire's heart. Years pass gently, marked not by grand events, but by the slow rhythm of endurance. Wallis grows older with elegance, her hair silver, her wit intact. Friends die, faces fade, and the city continues around her, louder than she has the strength to be. She no longer attends public gatherings, preferring the companionship of memory. In her final decade, she moves to a quieter home by the coast, where the sound of the ocean reminds her of England, its gray skies, its endless restraint, its beauty bound to melancholy. On calm days, she walks along the shore, the wind tugging lightly at her scarf, and thinks of the king not as monarch, but as a man she somehow loved across time, without touch, without meeting, without consequence. The narrator's voice softens like the dimming of evening light. "It is said that some loves are written in flame, and others in mist. The first burn quickly, the second endure in silence, shaping the air long after the fire has gone." In 1962, the newspapers announced the death of Queen Alexandra, beloved widow of King Edward VIII. The coverage is brief but reverent, tributes to her dignity, her grace, her steadfast heart. Wallis reads the obituary in her seaside home, her hands trembling slightly as she holds the paper. The article includes a photograph of the Queen in her later years, seated by a window, her face lined but serene. Beneath it, the caption reads, "She carried the memory of a quieter world." Wallis sets the paper down and whispers, "So did he." Then she closes her eyes, and for a long moment she imagines them both, Edward and Alexandra, standing once more beneath that old oak tree, their faces turned toward a horizon of light. As the years narrow to their final quiet, Wallis feels less regret than gratitude. She has come to understand that history's kindness often lies not in what it gives, but in what it spares. She has been spared exile, ruin, and the endless glare of judgment. She has also been spared love's destruction, and though her name will never be written in gold within the chronicles of monarchs, it will exist, faint and enduring, as the outline of a story that might have been. One evening, as the sun sinks behind the sea, she writes a final line in her notebook. Some destinies are fulfilled by being denied. She closes the cover, rests her pen beside it, and listens to the waves beyond her window. The tide rises, then falls, its rhythm matching her breath, steady and unafraid. The light fades, the sea darkens, and in the quiet she smiles. A small, knowing smile, as if she has at last made peace with the life she never lived. Time, that softest and most merciless of sculptors, moves its hand lightly across the lives it leaves behind. The world turns toward modernity, faster and brighter than any generation before it, and those who once danced in the glow of chandeliers now find themselves fading into sepia tones. The memory of King Edward VIII drifts into history's quieter pages, his portrait hanging in dusty halls where school children pass, without pausing to read the plaque. His reign, so short in years, so long in shadow, has become a parable of restraint, of the dangers of feeling too little rather than too much. Yet somewhere, far from the palaces and archives, another name continues to hum faintly in the margins of memory. Wallis Simpson, the woman who never met her destiny and so became its ghost. In her final years, Wallis lives in quiet seclusion by the sea. The days unfold gently, as if reluctant to disturb her peace. She wakes early to the sound of gulls and the distant toll of a harbor bell, takes tea on her veranda, and watches the morning light spill across the water. The rhythm of her life is simple, deliberate, a far cry from the glittering chaos of the society she once moved through so effortlessly. Yet in that stillness, there is something almost regal about her, a kind of dignity untouched by circumstance. Visitors who meet her in these years describe her not as lonely, but as serene, her eyes bright with the calm of one who has made her peace with both history and herself. On her writing desk sits the same leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with fragments of thought, reflections, and letters never sent. Sometimes she rereads them, tracing the fading ink with a fingertip, as though reacquainting herself with an old friend. In one passage written years earlier, she had confessed, "We measure love by its noise, but perhaps its truest form is silence, the kind that follows a song too beautiful to be repeated." Now older and nearer to the end, she smiles at her younger self, amused by the drama of her own wisdom. She no longer romanticizes what might have been. She simply accepts that her life, though ordinary in history's eyes, was extraordinary in its avoidance of tragedy. Each summer, she receives a small bouquet of white roses from an anonymous sender in England. The first time it arrived, decades ago, she had wondered if it might be a coincidence. But the message, always the same, written in a firm, elegant hand, said otherwise, for what was not but was meant kindly. She never sought to discover the sender. Whether it was a gesture from the palace, an old friend of Thelma's, or the distant hand of someone who once remembered her name, she never knew. It did not matter. The roses, arriving faithfully each year, became a quiet conversation between the living and the lost. She would place them in a vase beside her window, their fragrance mingling with the salt air, and whisper softly, "Thank you." The narrator's voice becomes a gentle wind moving across memory. "Not every crown rests upon a head," he murmurs, "and not every queen sits upon a throne. Some reign within the invisible kingdom of what might have been, ruling only the quiet realm of reflection." As the 1960s turn to the 1970s, the world grows noisier, impatient with the slow dignity of the past. Young people speak of revolution, of freedom, of breaking all that once bound their parents. Wallis watches these changes with amusement. She recognizes in their fire the same hunger that once burned in the young prince who never became her lover, the same defiance against constraint, the same yearning for meaning. She smiles and murmurs to herself, "Every generation must invent its own scandal." Yet beneath her wit lies tenderness. She knows rebellion without wisdom consumes itself, just as obedience without heart turns to stone. And so she regards the world's turbulence with compassion, as one who has seen both freedom and its cost. In the spring of her 84th year, she falls ill. The doctors call it frailty, the slow surrender of the body to time, but she knows better. "It isn't illness," she tells her nurse with a faint smile. "It's simply that I've seen enough of this story." The nurse laughs softly, uncertain whether to take her seriously. But Wallis's tone is serene, not melancholy. She spends her remaining days writing a few last notes in her journal, tidying her desk, and watching the sea from her window. One evening, as the sun slips below the horizon and the sky melts into a wash of silver and rose, she feels a familiar calm settle over her. She thinks briefly of Ernest, long gone, kind and forgettable, of Thelma, whose careless friendship once redirected the world without knowing it, and of Edward, the king who lived and died for silence. "We were all in our way," she whispers, faithful to something. She closes her eyes and rests her hand upon the notebook's cover, as though sealing a letter that will never need to be sent. The narrator's voice slows, tender and reverent. And so she left as she had lived, not with scandal or applause, but with a sigh. The world, too hurried to notice, did not mark her passing with mourning. But somewhere, in a forgotten garden of England, the white roses still arrived that spring, though no one remained to receive them. In the years that follow, her name re-emerges now and then in the footnotes of history. Scholars, intrigued by the alternate course of fate, write of her as the queen who never was, a woman whose absence preserved the monarchy, whose forgotten grace altered the shape of an empire. Some paint her as tragic, others as blessed, but none can define her entirely. Her legend, having never burned, endures instead as a quiet glow, a reminder that destiny sometimes speaks most profoundly through silence. And in this imagined world, where history took a gentler road, the story of Wallis Simpson becomes not one of ruin, but of mercy. The empire survives, the monarchy endures, and somewhere beyond the tide of centuries, a woman who was never crowned remains eternal, not in jewels, not in portraits, but in the delicate echo of what she was meant to be. The decades move forward with the inevitability of waves upon stone, smoothing the rough edges of the past until even sorrow becomes beautiful. By the 1970s, Britain has grown into something smaller, humbler, more human. The empire that once girdled the world has dissolved into memory and mutual understanding, leaving behind not dominion but nostalgia. The monarchy, though diminished in power, endures, less a command than a symbol, less divine than domestic. Portraits of Queen Alexandra and the late King Edward VIII hang in quiet corridors at Windsor Castle, their colors softened by time, their eyes serene but knowing. To those who pass, they seem to watch with benevolent distance, like figures who have accepted at last the limits of both love and legacy. The new generation of royals, youthful, ambitious, unburdened by the ghosts of war, rarely speak of Edward. To them, he is an ancestral echo, a chapter concluded long before their own story began. But to the older courtiers, those few who still remember his quiet reign, his name is spoken with a kind of reverent melancholy. They recall a man who walked through duty like a sleepwalker through fog, calm, kind, and unreachable. They say he was not made for kingship, yet they also admit that no one ever bore it with greater gentleness. He left behind no grand reforms, no monuments of empire, only the faint impression of decency, like a footprint in sand before the tide. At Windsor, the years layer themselves over memory like thin veils of dust. Each generation restores the castle's walls, polishes its silver, arranges the portraits just so, but the air retains whispers that no broom can sweep away. Some say that on quiet winter evenings, a faint music can be heard drifting through the long walk, an old gramophone tune, thin and wavering, carried on the wind. The guards, pragmatic men of routine, smile at the superstition. Yet one, a veteran of many cold nights, swears he once saw a figure standing by the great oak near the garden gate, a man in uniform, head slightly bowed as though listening to a memory. When the guard approached, the figure vanished, leaving only the soft scent of tobacco and rain. He told no one for years, but when he finally did, an older servant nodded gravely and said, "His Majesty loved to walk there after dark. It was his way of remembering the world before he belonged to it." The narrator's voice deepens, gentle but unflinching. In every house that has endured centuries, there come to dwell the presences not of those who died, but of those who endured too long. Windsor keeps its ghosts not as hauntings, but as memories that refuse to fade. For the people of Britain, the story of Edward and Alexandra becomes a kind of moral fable, one of duty's triumph over desire, of stability purchased through surrender. In an age of rapid change, their reign is remembered as a still point, a pause in history's breath. School children recite the dates without emotion, unaware that behind those calm years lay the silent ache of what was never lived. Yet among historians and poets, a different sentiment persists, a wondering if perhaps too much was sacrificed at the altar of peace. They speak of the quiet sadness that threads through photographs of the king, of the way his eyes seem to gaze not at the camera, but beyond it, towards something irretrievably lost. Some suggest that, had he known rebellion, the monarchy might have fractured. Others whisper that it might have lived more fully for having bled. In that long corridor between speculation and memory stands the figure of Wallis Simpson, still haunting the story's edge even in absence. Her image survives in a few surviving photographs, graceful, poised, eyes bright with ironic intelligence. The queen who never was, yet whose shadow softened a throne. The scholars who write about Edward inevitably write of her, imagining her presence like a missing color in an unfinished painting. Had they met, one historian writes, he might have abdicated his crown and Britain its calm. Yet in not meeting, they preserved an age from breaking. In the delicate mathematics of destiny, their distance was its salvation. The castle at Windsor endures. Its stones, weathered but steadfast, hold the memory of centuries like a great, slow heartbeat. In the evenings, when the sun descends and the fields beyond glow with the last light, the air takes on a peculiar hush. Visitors walking the grounds often pause without knowing why, sensing the weight of something gentle but vast, a sorrow without tragedy, a peace without joy. The locals call it the King's Hour, that lingering stillness before dusk when the sky turns the color of old silver. They say it is the moment when Edward's spirit, ever polite, passes through the gardens once more, pausing briefly to look back upon the world he once ruled and never quite understood. The narrator lingers here, his tone softening like the fading of a hymn. Every kingdom, no matter how long its line, becomes at last a gallery of ghosts. Not all are mourned. Some are remembered simply for the calm they left behind, the still water after the tempest, the silence following the song. Such was Edward's legacy, the throne he did not abandon, the love he did not meet, the peace he could not feel, all now rest within the stones of Windsor, where time itself walks softly. And so the monarchy continues, reshaped but unbroken, its rituals gentler, its power thinner, its humanity brighter for the shadows that once passed through it. The ghosts linger not to frighten but to remind that behind every crown beats the fragile, ordinary heart of a man or woman who once looked toward the horizon and wondered what might lie beyond. In this way, Edward remains, unseen but not forgotten, a whisper among the corridors, a soft presence in the turning of keys, the closing of doors, the last echo of footsteps at night. He does not haunt with sorrow, only with gentleness, as if to say that history, too, can learn forgiveness. And somewhere, far away across the ocean, another ghost walks beside him, the woman who never met him, yet changed his fate all the same. Together they drift through time's quiet chambers, companions at last in the stillness that eluded them in life. There comes a moment when one looks far enough back upon the corridors of time that all distinctions between what was and what might have been dissolve into a single, gentle light. It is the light of distance, the soft illumination that forgives, that accepts, that no longer seeks to separate fact from feeling. History, after all, is not a monument of certainty, but a tide of memory washing over the shores of imagination. And in that light we may see the figure of King Edward VIII standing once more upon the terrace of Windsor, his gaze lifted toward a horizon he could never quite reach. The years have softened him into symbol, and yet beneath the marble stillness of legacy, the pulse of a living heart remains, a man who carried the weight of peace, and in doing so, surrendered the poetry of passion. What remains of him in this world is not grandeur, but grace. He is remembered not for what he did, but for what he refused to do, for the scandal he did not cause, the crown he did not cast aside, the love he never dared to claim. His reign, quiet and restrained, becomes a mirror in which the people see themselves, the endurance of ordinary life, the silent dignity of restraint, the courage of those who walk their appointed path without reward. The empire, now long transformed into a commonwealth of equals, looks back upon his years not as the twilight of monarchy, but as its slow reawakening. For by preserving the crown through stillness, he allowed it to live long enough to change. The narrator's voice deepens, low and reflective, like the last notes of an old hymn. It is said that great history is forged by those who act, but there is another kind, quieter, humbler, no less true, written by those who refrain. A single withheld gesture, a word never spoken, can turn the course of nations. In that silence of action lies the paradox of Edward's legacy. His choice not to rebel preserved the structure that had bound him. His obedience saved the monarchy from collapse, even as it hollowed his own spirit. And yet, through that sacrifice, Britain was allowed to endure long enough to rediscover its humanity. The generations that followed inherited not his melancholy, but his mercy, the understanding that the world is too fragile to be ruled only by pride. Far across the sea, in that quiet seaside house where Wallis Simpson once wrote her reflections, the air still carries traces of salt and lilac, the faint music of the waves mingling with memory. Her notebook, now faded and brittle, rests in the hands of some curious scholar who found it decades later in an old estate sale. Within its pages lies no confession of love, no bitterness, only fragments of grace. The final entry reads simply, "We are all the sum of our hesitations." It is neither sorrowful nor self-pitying. It is a truth spoken by one who understood that destiny's greatest mercy is sometimes denial. Her words, once personal, become universal, a small light burning in the vast library of history, gentle but enduring. And so, in this quiet imagining, the great romance that never was becomes its own kind of parable. The woman who might have shattered an empire instead spares it. The king who might have defied his crown instead fulfills it. Their separate silences form a harmony more lasting than scandal or rebellion ever could. It is not the kind of story the poets crave, but it is one the world needs. A reminder that even restraint can be heroic, that not every revolution requires noise. At Windsor, the air itself seems to remember. The gardens bloom as they always have, the lawns stretching toward the horizon like a sigh. Tourists pass through the corridors where portraits of forgotten monarchs gaze down in patient stillness. None linger long before Edward's image, though a few pause, drawn by something they cannot name. His face, captured in that formal calm, holds a mystery. Neither triumph nor tragedy, only a question. What does it mean to be human within history's machinery? What does it cost to serve both crown and conscience? The answers do not lie within the paint, but in the silence between the strokes, the quiet that holds both absence and forgiveness. The narrator pauses as though listening for something beyond words. "If you stand still long enough within those halls," he whispers, "you may hear the faint sound of breath, not the ghostly sigh of the dead, but the living exhalation of time itself. For history, too, breathes. It inhales our choices, our hesitations, our forgotten kindnesses, and exhales them into the ages. And what of us, the listeners, sitting now in our own twilight, remembering a world that was never quite ours? Perhaps we are drawn to such stories not for their grandeur, but for their mercy, for within them we glimpse our own frailty reflected, the small decisions that alter the shape of our lives, the moments of restraint that become invisible monuments. History is not built solely by the bold and the brave. It is also shaped by the cautious, the quiet, and the tender-hearted who, in choosing not to shatter what stands before them, allow something gentler to endure. As the last light fades over the fields of Windsor, the air grows still. The oak tree sways softly in the dusk, its leaves whispering with the calm rhythm of remembrance. The king and the queen, long gone, linger here, not as specters, but as symbols of endurance, of compassion, of love transmuted into something higher than possession. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the veil of time, a woman in pearls and wit walks beside them, neither intruder nor queen, simply herself. Together they move through eternity's quiet garden, their silence the final word in a story that once trembled upon the edge of history and chose, instead, to rest. The narrator's final words are almost a prayer. In the end, history is not the record of what happened, but the memory of what we choose to believe. And sometimes, the gentlest alteration, the introduction never made, the love never kindled, is enough to change the very breath of the world. The wind sighs once more through the ancient branches. The music fades into quiet. The story ends not with triumph or tragedy, but with stillness, the eternal, forgiving stillness of time remembering itself.